Greetings, Teleologic Jones, back with another fill-in video, or Cosmological Metaphysics Lesson 1B. Just making, again, some clarifications that in some of my hastily chosen words and I made some claims about Aristotle in that, or a principal claim about Aristotle in that video, that he was a perceptual realist. And I thought, well, maybe I better, consult the text and not just go by memory. First video, that Aristotle was a perceptual realist. And so I went to the categories and have read through them. I can't say I comprehended them altogether any better than the first time I read them many years ago. But I'm beginning to understand his language. It's somewhat confusing to us because the kinds of things that he considers real are things that we would consider not to have that sense of reality anymore. This is a big topic. I'm way above my pay scale to really engage in this level of critique of Aristotle, although it is just an intuition I have from reading the categories, that he is, by our current thinking, we might call him a naive observer because he sees a tree. When the truth of the matter, his case for perceptual realism is even stronger. His case is really, that is the tree. And that is, his case for perceptual realism and for the reality of objects outside of us is much stronger than I had initially stated here. Because this statement can be read two ways. It can be, I see a tree, meaning it's on the seeing part, it's on the perceptive part, it's on the internal part over here, versus I see a tree. Now it's out here. I will, in a future video, be making a more dynamic case for perceptual realism, and that is that it is a relationship between the objects, partly passive and partly active, partly conscious, partly unconscious. And yet it is still perception as a real sense of awareness of our belonging in space, in time and space, amongst the objects that we happen to currently be with, is real. And I think sometimes we look at somebody like Aristotle and we consider him, I don't mean we, I mean contemporary philosophy and sociology and such that have become kind of ignorant of his writings. They tend to see this as sort of naive before the great enlightenment we had with the awareness of basically that came from men like Descartes, which we're going to also be looking at here briefly as a correction, or at least a clarification of my comments about Descartes. That it's better for us to read Aristotle as unconvoluted rather than as in some way naive. He doesn't have the burden of a lot of this doubts, the uncertainty, the anxiety of the isolation of the observer and the radical separation of the observer from this radical separation between the person and the objects of sense, that there's some kind of mysterious unknown, and it is through over this divide that we try to bridge ourselves, but we never really can get to here. And there's a lot of anxiety, even depression, that comes from this kind of worldview. I mean, it's one thing for academics to hold this kind of view and have some kind of conversation about it. It's another thing for people to live in a world that's this way, that the world is somehow alien to them in a way, that they are forever solipsistically isolated. And these kinds of philosophies are still pervasive. And yet, from the Catholic and Christian perspective, they are and must be seen as being utterly false. So I've been making a case for perceptual realism in a dynamic sense more fully in the next video before I get back to gravity, but laying down the groundwork of, as we were saying before, as I said before, the principal question here, the initial question of perception theory, we want to know, well, what can we know first? But we need to understand our condition, our human condition, our perceptive condition as an observing body, according to the Aristotelian language. How can we know what we know? And that's the initial question of any kind of inquiry we're going to have around philosophy, science, and so forth. You know, when we're making claims about observations, measurements, quantifications at a more complex level than just simply observing an object, we want to know what it is that we see, what are its qualities, what are its quantities, and how do we then take those quantities and qualities and its interrelations, its causes, the things that its existence both as affect and effect and such. We need to have some clear understanding of what it is, and how can we know that? Well, we first receive things through our perceptions. But let's get to Aristotle's own words here. To see his strong case for perceptual realism. This is a section from the complete works of Aristotle, which I have on Kindle here, and some of those details in terms of the publication stuff are not as easy to find as you would like, but the translation is by E.M. Edgehill, who I believe is one of two principal English translators in recent times. And I think from what I've been able to discover, there were no very commonly circulated translations of Aristotle into the vernacular until the 20th century. If I'm wrong about that, happy to be wrong about that. Which goes to show more clearly that one really did still need to Again, if all animals ceased to exist, there would be no knowledge. But there might yet be many objects of knowledge. It is likewise the case with regard to perception. For the object of perception is, it appears, prior to the act of perception. If the perceptible is annihilated, perception also will cease to exist. But the annihilation of perception does not cancel the existence of the perceptible. For perception implies a body perceived and a body in which perception takes place. Now, if that which is perceptible is annihilated, it follows that the body is annihilated, for the body is a perceptible thing. That if the body does not exist, it follows that perception also ceases to exist. Thus, the annihilation of the perceptible involves that of perception. But the annihilation of perception does not involve that of the perceptible. For if the animal is annihilated, it follows that perception also is annihilated. But perceptibles, such as body, heat, sweetness, bitterness, and so on, will remain. Now, this is the case, what I was talking about, the language that he uses, because we're used to talking about things in kind of in their atomic or in their deconstructed material state, whereas he speaks about things in terms of their experience. But in that experience, such as sweetness, though he knows nothing of the molecular structure of sugars and how they interact with the cells on the tongue to produce the effect of sweetness or other molecular forms which create the experience of bitterness, that doesn't matter because we, at the level of experience, talk about sweetness. We don't, every time we talk about sweetness, talk about sugar molecules, though we may in our mind imagine them because we have some experience or knowledge to make that association. But from his perspective, these things still will exist, even if there were no conscious, perceptible beings, even animals of any kind, which animals do also perceive. Even plants react to their environment and therefore perceive in a kind of, according to the vegetative soul, in some kind of limited way. But if all such bodies were no longer present to perceive, this would not stop there being the existence of things to be perceived, such as body, heat, sweetness, bitterness, and so on. So this is a very strong case we have seen here that Aristotle has made for perceptual realism. As he says here, this is likewise the case with regard for perception, for the object of perception is, it appears, prior to the act of perception. And this is exactly what Descartes will be seen to bring into doubt, and we'll look at that very soon here. But we just want to make this case here for Aristotelian perceptual realism, that he's not in any way feeling the need, it certainly isn't for lack of intelligence on his part, but he isn't feeling any need to doubt the existence of things outside of himself. Now, we get this idea that we've become more sophisticated, and therefore we doubt or we know some kind of little trick about how our perceptions are only in ourselves, and we can think of the Bishop Berkeley and his excruciating system of all we have is perceptions. And this leads to a lot of the kind of even AI kind of fantasies about AI becoming conscious. This idea of the isolation of this internalization or the solipsization of the person, making them kind of radically separated from the rest of the world, such as they cannot, escape the prison of their own being. Aristotle knows none of this sort of childishness, I'll call it. And let's have a look at Descartes' challenge to this. As we had said before, we had Descartes popped in the middle and said, wait a minute, you're assuming way too much. All we have is our perceptions. I perceive a tree. I don't see a tree. I certainly don't make the claim that that is a tree. All I can say is that is something inside of me. I have an experience of tree, but I can't know anything more than that. So we have here from Meditations on First Philosophy, Meditation 1 of the things which we may doubt. Section 1, or paragraph 1. They labeled, yes, paragraph 1. Several years have elapsed now since I first became aware that I had accepted, even from my youth, many false opinions for true, and that consequently what I afterward based on such principles was highly doubtful. And from that time I was convinced of the necessity of undertaking once in my life to rid myself of all opinions I had adopted, and of commencing anew the work of building from the foundation, if I desired to establish a firm and abiding superstructure in the sciences. But as this enterprise appeared to me to be one of great magnitude, I waited until I had attained an age so mature as to leave me no hope that at any stage of life more advanced I should be better able to execute my design. On this account I have delayed so long that I should henceforth consider I was doing wrong, were I still to consume in deliberation any of the time that now remains for action. Today, then, since I have opportunely freed my mind from all cares and am happily disturbed by no passions, and since I am in the secure possession of leisure in a peaceable retirement, I will at length apply myself earnestly and freely to the general overthrow of all my former positions. But to this end it will not be necessary for me to show that the whole of these are false, a point perhaps which I shall never reach. But as even now my reason convinces me that I ought not to less carefully to withhold belief from what is not entirely certain and indubitable than from what is manifestly false, it will be sufficient to justify the rejection of the whole if I shall find in each some ground for doubt. Nor for this purpose will it be necessary even to deal with each belief individually, which would be truly an endless labor. But, as the removal from below of the foundation necessarily involves the downfall of the whole edifice, I will at once approach the criticism of the principles on which all my former beliefs rested. And I will cut in here now and make a little comment. This is confirming what I had said before when I talk about Cartesian resentment, that there's a lot here that, to withhold belief from what is not entirely certain and indubitable. Well, whatever satisfies that? I mean, there are certain things. We could get into that about mathematical formula and stuff. But even then, he's going to later bring that into doubt. How do I know that I am not deceived in thinking that 2 + 2 = 4? How can I ever know any of these things if once I begin to put myself in the place of doubting that I am not actually a body amongst other bodies, a perceiving body amongst other bodies in the Aristotelian sense? As soon as I begin to bring that into doubt and start imagining that I'm in a simulation, or which he effectively puts forward the proposition that we could be in some kind of simulation. There's no end to it. There is no way of getting out of it. Of course, later on, Descartes will try to pull himself out of this pit. But my question is, why do we ever need to go in it to begin with? There's no need for it. And what it ends up doing is just leaving a lot of residual dysfunction in terms of thinking, in terms of even spiritual dysfunction, because it isolates us from our world. It puts us in ourselves in a way that it makes us a fertile ground for very certain kinds of vices, in terms of vices that are, well, most vices are about selfishness, but vices of selfishness, isolation, of distance from the other, because they are just, so many perceptions in our own soul. We have no idea what their actual existence is and such. And this is based on this criteria, which is a false criteria, that is not entirely certain and indubitable. Well, there is no such thing. I mean, there are certain things that can be more certain than other things, sure. But in terms of satisfying an absolute desire for doubting, no, there is no such thing. We must, in some sense, engage the world in trust and in faith, which you can read in the Aristotelian account. He doesn't make a case for it. The case is made in what we postmoderns would call the subtext. The case is made in his assumptions. You can see how he sees the world based on what he simply takes as being true. Let's continue here with Descartes, though. All that I have up to this moment accepted as possessed of the highest truth and certainty, I received either from or through the senses. So we're on to perception now. I observed, however, that these sometimes mislead us. Sometimes we think we see something that's not there. And it is the part of prudence not to place absolute confidence in that by which we have once been deceived. And this here, I think, is the key error in this whole thing, because this is what begins the doubt spiral that Descartes enters into. It is true that if something willfully misleads us, that it is the part of prudence not to place absolute confidence in that thing. And that is going to be, if something's willfully doing it, well, that's going to be an agent, a person, a being. So if a being is going to mislead us, it is true that there is wisdom in not. It's wise not to take that person's claims for as true, at least not without some qualification. Now, if they deceived us only because they were mistaken, well, that's not really deception, is it? If they deceived us intentionally, well, then maybe through some period of time they may earn our trust again, because they consistently speak the truth to us for some period of time. But if they were then again to engage in deception, well, then they would probably lose our trust forever, because we would consider them to be a highly untrustworthy person. But these are agents. We're not talking about perceptions here. We're not talking about perceptions here, such as, let's say in this setup here, obviously we're all engaged in some kind of deception right here, because this isn't actually a tree. It's just some pixels organized on the page. I'm not actually talking to you live. It's a recording of me. This arrow pointer is just an app device. It doesn't even exist. What does it mean that there's an arrow there? Well, it's just a shape of pixels. This is not actually an eye, nor is it actually a diagram of an eye. It's an image, and so forth. We engage in seeing things that aren't real and accepting them as being the things that we want them to be through a willful engagement in deception all the time as we engage in audiovisual media. That's not what I'm... So, nobody's going to say this is an actual tree, but we are, for imagination's sake, saying there is a physical tree here. Or maybe there isn't. Maybe this is just a cardboard cutout, and maybe I'm over here. Let's go back to Aristotle. So I'm here. I'm actually looking at this thing. What is it I'm looking at? Well, Aristotle says I see a tree, or I perceive that. No, I perceive. He says that's a tree. But let's say it's actually just a really effective cardboard cutout of a tree. And let's say he said, oh, that's a tree over there. And then somebody says, oh, no, they knock it down. They say, you were deceived, Aristotle. You didn't see a tree. And then he would say, oh, well, there we go. Anybody can be deceived, even Aristotle. Why would he know he was deceived? Well, he knows he's deceived because it was proven to him that he was deceived. Now maybe he could have seen the cardboard cutout tree, thought it was a tree, and moved on. I mean, if it didn't mean anything to his life, if he didn't have any reason to engage the tree, well, it doesn't really matter. Does it matter that sometimes you see a cardboard cutout and call it a tree when it's actually just a cardboard cutout, not a tree? Not really. I mean, no, not really at all. But if you needed the tree, like let's say you thought it had almonds on it or something and you were hungry and you wanted to go over to it, and then you found out, oh, it's not actually a tree, it's just a cardboard cutout. Well, how did you find out that it wasn't a real tree and it was a cardboard cutout? With your perceptions. With your sense perceptions. With your engagement with the object in all of your senses. You walked closer to get a better look. Aristotle walked closer. He got a better look. He was hoping to get some almonds, and he saw that he couldn't get any almonds because this was just a fake tree, not a real tree. But how does he know it's a fake tree? He knows it's a fake tree because he knows what a real tree is, because he knows it through his perceptions and his conceptions. So when we engage the world dynamically, not just passively, perception by perception. It isn't just a passive coming at you one way thing. And in their case, it's actually more like this. It's just, this is it. Like you have kind of a broken sense of what it is. It's in fact dynamic. Perception is a dynamic relationship. We receive some information. We think, oh, what's that? Oh, it either fits some concept and satisfies us for the moment of our reception. Oh, that's a tree, but it's the wrong kind of tree. And we may look at it and say, oh, maybe that is the right kind of tree. Is that the right kind of tree that's going to have the nuts on it that I want? Well, let me get a little closer. Let me change my perception. Let me make my perception of that tree is going to occupy a larger place in my visual field. Therefore, I'm going to be able to have a closer look. I can actually maybe get right up to it and touch it and look at it. And if by the time I get to it, I find out it's not a tree at all, but just a painting of a tree, then indeed I was, at this point, deceived initially. But by the time I got here, I overcame my deception because I engaged with my perceptions and with the concepts that I carry from my previous previous perceptions to find the truth. And is it absolute truth? Well, no, of course, it can never be. I've been making that point before. But is it functionally absolute truth? Let's put that down here. We can call it a functional absolute truth. Well, there may be some who dislike the term absolute in that case, and maybe I don't blame them. So we'll just call it functional epistemology instead. That we have a way through dynamic engagement to engage the world and find out the truths about it. Not just passively receiving sense information, but actively engaging. We may even need to cut the thing apart to look at it, to have some further understanding of it. But this will all be through our perceptions coming closer to the truth. So the fact that our perceptions sometimes may deceive us, as that we are sometimes misled, such as in the case when Aristotle thought the tree was an almond tree and it wasn't. It actually was just a cardboard cutout. Not that they had cardboard 2,500 years ago, but you get it. Yes, they do sometimes mislead us, but we aren't passive in that. I mean, there may be cases they mislead us and we have, we're driving down the road and a cat runs across the street in front of us and we hit the brakes, but actually it was a dog. Well, something ran across the street. We, for whatever reason, assumed it was a cat. Maybe we never know that it was a dog, and we tell this story over and over again in our lives, and we're wrong because it was a dog and not a cat. Does that matter? It doesn't matter. If it mattered and we needed to have a look at it, come closer to it, we'd find out, oh, it wasn't a cat, it was a dog. But for the story, for anything in our lives, it doesn't matter. And were we deceived? Not really deceived. We missaw. We misperceived. That's not deception, because there's no willful desire to engage us in deception. And I don't want to go any further into into Descartes than this for now, only to show that there is a fundamental immaturity at the base of his doubt system. And that is, we are sometimes misled. It is prudent not to place absolute confidence in that by which we have once been deceived. Now, this is a translation issue, I'm not sure, because we go from sometimes misleads us, which is okay, I don't mind mislead. And it is the part of prudence not to place absolute confidence. I'll even agree with that. Absolute confidence, functional confidence, sure. We can get closer and closer to truth through engagement, and we can get up to functional epistemology, functionally absolute epistemology in confidence about certain things. But to immediately place absolute confidence in just in a perception because we thought we saw something, of course not. Aristotle wouldn't, and does not in his work, advise this. He's not a perceptual naivist. He's a perceptual realist. Yeah, he's a perceptual realist, not a perceptual naivist. Of course, careful observation, consideration, confirmation of observation. All these things are important. In the case of the cat or dog or just the animal running across the street, what matters is that we're seeing a body running in front of us, and that we know that bodies that move like that are sentient, mostly. It could be a radio-controlled car, maybe. But even then, it's a thing of value. We don't want to run it over, because there may be some implications to that. First of all, just the burden of cost of the running over the radio-controlled car for the stupid kid who's driving it in front of us. Or it's the pain and suffering of a sentient being in the dog or cat or whatever beast it is that's running in front of us. There's a reason why we respond by hitting the brakes, because we don't want that cost. We don't want to incur that cost, which has been suddenly thrown in front of us. Now, whether it's a cat or a dog means nothing. I mean, unless, of course, we would run over a cat but not a dog, or the other way around. That's a personal kind of choice. Most normally healthy-minded people would simply want to hit the brakes so they didn't hit the thing, for their own protection and the protection of the creature running in front of them. But this need for absolute, sometimes mislead us. It is in the part of prudence not to place absolute confidence. Yeah, of course we don't place absolute confidence in them prior to confirmation. But we can have, as I said, functional epistemological. We can operate within a functional epistemology. And then he carries on here, which is not to have absolute confidence in that by which we have once been deceived. And that's where maybe the translation, I can't access the original languages myself. I mean, I could make some attempt at looking at them and seeing if it's a different word. If anyone knows that these are different words used here between mislead and deceive, that would be a helpful comment for somebody to add to this discussion. But it isn't deception in the sense of our sense of moral deception. It is merely us misseeing, but as I said before, we have the capacity through interaction, through dynamic perception, to come to the truth, at least to a functional truth, such that we realize there is a tree because of our previous engagements with such things as trees, and that seeing it from a distance is merely the beginning of our perception of the thing. It may be sufficient for our needs at the moment, and it may not be sufficient for our needs at the moment. And therefore we may engage the tree to see either what kind it is or whatever reason we have to, or Aristotle may have to want to come to the tree. Maybe to sit in its shade. There's teaches classes there in the shade of the tree. I think that was more Platonic. Anyway, there's no deception, and there's no reason to bring into doubt these perceptions, and even more so because we can correct them, because that means there's a standard of truth against which we can measure them, and therefore we are not being deceived. We may be misled on occasion. We may be deceived visually, especially these days. With AI images and such, we're seeing all kinds of things that aren't even real audiovisual representations. They are completely fabricated. So the issue of being deceived is huge, but not in the physical world, in the audiovisual, in the media world that we live in. Sure, we got to be on our guard more than ever, because we have been deceived greatly for a long time, and now that deception is growing and growing and growing into a kind of monstrous deception that we increasingly live under, or potentially do. But again, even with these things, what is the standard against which we measure things as being true or not? Well, we have perceptions and conceptions by which to measure the things that we're receiving as being presented to us for as true or not. And so it is because we have this capacity as perceivers, as realist perceivers, as perceivers of the real. And I will do one more video without presenting a stronger case for, or a simplified and better a better placed case for perceptual realism, but the ideas of which I have hinted on in this video and in the previous ones. But for now, that's it. I hope this has been helpful, and please comment, like and subscribe. I guess people say that. I don't have a lot of viewers of my videos, although the last one is last few have gone viral from my perspective. I've got 108 views on lesson 1 and 88 views on the revision lesson. Oh, that reminds me, sorry. One last thing before we go. I wanted to make a clarification of my clarification, if that is reasonable. The clarification of the clarification is that when I made these graphics here, or this graphic I'd done in the previous video, lesson 1A, talking about the void, which is the blue-gray background, deep blue background, matter being the orange section, substance being either the substance in the traditional sense prior to the existence of matter, and then emergence, principles, attributes, even states of being that emerge outside of the material, that are emergent properties of matter. From this worldview, from the traditional Christian conception, magnetism would probably be in this area, whereas consciousness, or the soul, the awareness of the soul, would actually be prior to the material. But I didn't show that this is actually the graph for the materialist point of view. So if this is the ensoulment model, this is the consciousness model. Matter comes into being either just simply by always being there in the perpetualist view, or matter comes into being spontaneously with all of its attending properties, definitions, attributes, energies, and so forth. But anything complex that we consider, such as consciousness, is an emergent property on top of this material being, which has no substantial cause whatsoever. It just simply comes into being, and then meaning or pattern or structure somehow is placed on top of it. And sometimes they will say even just artificially placed on top of it, because we are pattern recognizing machines somehow, or biological units somehow. Therefore, we're inclined to apply patterns to things because that's important for us. But it's important for us, again, this gets us to this perceptual problem. It's important for us because the patterns are real, and it's important for us to respond to the patterns. It's not that the patterns aren't real. We recognize patterns because there are patterns. Sometimes people see patterns that aren't there, like patterns in the numbers, the time on their phone when they answer it. There's a pattern they sometimes might see. They might see a certain number often and therefore attribute meaning to it. There may be meaning to it. There probably isn't, but that's a kind of pattern recognition that all kinds of superstitions are pattern recognitions that have little grounding in reality. But that doesn't mean all pattern recognition is false. We understand matter is full of patterns that are real, that are in fact, we must say substantial. So they're either substantial in themselves, or they are substantial prior to matter. This is a much more satisfying view of the world in terms of intellectually. This is not in any way satisfying. There's a huge missing object here in the middle, that what brings this to be? Why? Even if it's perpetual, why? This is why it's you can see the why in the being of the matter. The matter reveals the divine substance of its formation, of its being, because it represents in its patterns reason, structure, not randomness and chaos, but order, reason, structure. Anyway, I just wanted to make that clarification of my other clarification video, because I forgot to separate these two things to show that these are the two worldviews. I mean, I mentioned it in words, but I didn't show it. So this is what we're looking at. We're looking at a division between, when we're seeing a fundamental difference between the spirit, the divine model of being, material being, and the material, the one that's based entirely on matter. This is the difference between the strong metaphysics, affect metaphysics of God, and the effect metaphysics only of the material world. And we'll leave it at that for now. Teleologic Jones checking out. Hope you enjoyed this. Again, like and subscribe, share. Some people are obviously sharing the videos, I think, at this point. I mean, it's not a lot of listens, but I've had over 100 now on the previous video. And I mean, if you look at my other videos, they're all down below 50 mostly, and that's over more than a year of being up, and this is in less than a week. So somehow, some way, these videos are being shared and people are watching them. I mean, obviously it's possible to know how much people are watching them, and nobody's really engaging in terms of comments. Please do comment. I accept all comments, please. Corrections, anything. If you think I'm I have misrepresented either Aristotle or Descartes, or if you think that I'm in any way misrepresenting anything and misunderstanding anything, please let me know. Your opinions about that, affirmations, confirmations are also welcome. Any kind of engagement would be nice. The links to the books will be in the description. And that will be it for now. Teleologic Jones checking out.